Hello and welcome to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
This is Sam Wong, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and co-founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
So it's time to look down ticket. It's always hard to take your eyes off the presidential race, even for those of us who love to follow Congress and study Congress and report on Congress. The steel cage match that's taking place between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton seems to take all the oxygen out of the room. It's a spectacle unlike anything we've seen. But the reality is that the future of the Senate and the House might really be the biggest story. And this became an even bigger story as Donald Trump went to war with Paul Ryan after Paul Ryan distanced himself a bit with the revelation of the Access Hollywood tape. What happens with the House and Senate will really determine a lot about the next presidency. President Obama certainly learned this during his time in office, and I think many of us are now wondering what exactly the Trump effect will be on congressional races, what kind of impact this might have, not only in the Senate, but is there any possibility that the House, with large Republican majorities, might even swing to the Democrats? To help us sort through this, today Sam and I have a terrific guest, David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report. David is one of the shrewdest observers of Congress. He is the House editor of the Cook Report and is considered to be one of the best minds, and the Cook Report the best places to look for this kind of political analysis. He's also been an analyst for many other places, including NBC News, and he's appeared on nightly news shows for NBC, ABC, C-SPAN, Washington Journal, NPR, and much more. And he worked at Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball. So we are really delighted to have you, and welcome to our show, David.
Well, thanks. And you left out that I grew up right outside of Princeton, so I feel like I'm at home.
Yes.
Oh, even better.
I think you're from Montgomery, right?
That's correct.
Local boy.
So,
All right.
Okay, the hometown connection is always great for the show. Let me start off the conversation maybe by just asking where things are with the Senate. I've heard that Democrats will really need to do well in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, in Indiana, if they're going to take control, and maintaining control in other places like Wisconsin. Can you walk us through what's going on with some of the key Senate races?
Sure. Well, Republicans have a 54 to 46 seat advantage in the Senate today, so that means that Democrats need 4 seats plus the vice presidency or 5 seats to take the Senate outright. I really don't see a scenario where Democrats are picking up 5 seats and Trump is winning. So I like to say that Democrats need 4 seats for a technical majority. And Democrats are probably halfway there, considering they're ahead in Illinois and Wisconsin. 2 Republican senators, Mark Kirk and Ron Johnson, who are underwater right now. And that means that the Senate's really going to come down to the following 5 states: Nevada, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and North Carolina. And Democrats need to win 3 out of 5 because they already hold Nevada in order to get to 50 seats. So that's really where the Senate is going to be won or lost for Democrats. And at the moment, I think Democrats' best route to a majority probably runs out of those states through Nevada, New Hampshire, and probably Pennsylvania, although North Carolina is very close. Indiana has been a kind of a sneak attack by Democrats this cycle because Evan Bayh jumped in at the 11th hour. But I've always been very skeptical that Bayh would pull this race out, given the Republican nature of Indiana and Bayh's lobbying career and fancy house in D.C. in the recent past. So we're seeing that race come a bit back down to earth. If there is a sleeper race in the Senate, it's probably been Missouri, although I'm probably as skeptical that Democrats will ultimately win Missouri as Indiana. So we'll see.
But what about, it seems like in some cases there's not quite enough data to know where things have headed. I mean, your assessment overall seems quite accurate. But for instance, in Missouri, do we really know what the effect was of that ad in which Jason Kander reassembled an assault rifle blindfolded to demonstrate his bona fides on guns and challenged Roy Blunt to do the same thing?
It's a terrific question, but my question is, how many Trump voters in Missouri are really going to cross over and vote for a Democrat for Senate? I'm not really sure that is a critical mass of people, and that's also why I'm skeptical that Bai can win in Indiana, because you've got a state that's trended Republican. Blunt has not run a great campaign. He tried to hit Kander back over that ad, but all evidence we're seeing so far, including the Monmouth poll, shows that Trump still maintains a lead after the tape, the Access Hollywood tape. So it's going to take Kander defying some gravity to win this race.
But so I guess though one thing I think when I think about that evidence that you just presented is that it takes me back to this major theme that people probably need to be reminded of over and over again, the overwhelming nature of party loyalty, both up and down ticket in modern politics. And I just want to go back to Indiana for a second, where the factors you list are there, but we do have empirical evidence that at one point during the race, Evan Bayh appeared to be ahead. And so that's a case where we have evidence that there were some voters who were willing to vote for him. And I guess my question there is, what do we know about whether they're just gone now that he's got some unfavorable stories?
Well, yeah, I think party loyalty has become just such an overwhelming factor in a lot of these states that now there have been exceptions in recent Senate races, and they've tended to take place in very small states. I think of places like Montana, where John Tester has survived, or in North Dakota, where Heidi Heitkamp won a race in 2012, primarily because they had personal connections with their voters. But obviously, in Missouri and Indiana, there are examples of Democrats who have overperformed the top of the ticket as recently as 2012 to win Senate seats, in part because their opponents just melted down. I'm not sure Kander is such a stellar candidate in this, or a stellar prospect as a result of Blunt melting down over anything. We're talking up his chances because he has a great ad. So I think there is a bit of a difference.
Do you see, for those who don't follow this closely, one of the questions that's now out there is how are Democrats using Donald Trump in these Senate elections against Republicans? And getting back to what Sam asked, is there any ability to use Trump to break through some of the very strong GOP loyalty that you have in very red states or in these uncertain states where there's actual competition? Is this going to be a factor? I mean, what are you seeing? Is Trump going to allow Democrats to do better than if we had a Marco Rubio or one of the other Republicans in the race?
Well, first of all, it's not clear that Trump is behind in some of these red states. Now, clearly, in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, he's a liability. But there are plenty of states where Hillary Clinton is just as unpopular, if not more, as Donald Trump. Look, I think a lot of it comes down to how authentically Republicans handle the Trump question. And if you're Kelly Ayotte, you are probably in trouble because you've twisted yourself into a pretzel over Trump. First, you said that you would support the Republican nominee but not endorse Trump. Then in a debate, and by the way, voters' reaction is, what does that mean? That's politician speak. Then you get to this debate, and you're asked whether Donald Trump is a role model, and you trip over the question, and at one point say absolutely, makes its way into a Democratic ad, and then, of course, the Access Hollywood tape comes out and you unendorse. These are the kinds of pivots and strategic machinations that really strike voters as craven. So look, there are some Republicans who have handled his candidacy in a way that strikes voters as true to their own value sets, and then there are some who have clearly suffered as a result of trying too hard to please too many voters.
Is there a way to tell? I know that we haven't really drilled into it yet, but you have, from my prior reading and interactions with you, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of individual districts. And I wanted to turn a little bit to the question of to what extent you or any of us would be able to tell whether these things were starting to work. For instance, in your district ratings, how quickly can you figure out whether something's happening at that level?
Well, I think after an event like Access Hollywood, you need at least a week to be able to gauge fallout. So far, we have some early evidence that the bottom has not dropped out for Republicans in a lot of these congressional races. And we're constantly consuming polling data, both public and private data, on these individual House races. And most of the data comes from the parties because they have a vested interest in getting it right, in making spending decisions that will maximize their seat share in the election. And Democrats need to pick up of 30 seats to gain the House. Today, I think the most likely outlook is still a gain in the 5 to 20 seat range. That sounds like a really large range, but I do think there is a lot of volatility in the House because we don't know what the latest revelations do to Republican turnout. 30 seats is still a stretch for Democrats because the playing field is so narrow. It's not like there are 30 more seats where Republicans had an advantage of 5 points where all of a sudden they could tip over in some type of wave. We have a very narrow trading range of House seats that are competitive. We only rate 37 out of 435 as toss-ups or leans Democratic or leans Republican. And so even if Democrats won the entire toss-up column and lean Democratic column, they would still be a dozen seats short of the majority. They would need to win almost all of the races in lean Republican in order to be able to get 30 seats. And that's very difficult to do. And so we would need to start seeing these races move wholesale in Democrats' favor. And I haven't seen evidence in the last week that they have.
Well, let's see. But I'm sorry to keep on drilling, but since we have the expert here on the cast with us. For instance, recently, if I recall correctly, I think it was you guys who moved Scott Garrett in the 5th District of New Jersey from either lean or lean Republican over to toss-up. And so that's an example in which new information came in. So I want to get back to this question of when you gather information, how quickly are you going to find out whether that changes? Because you just described the scene as being as if it were fixed, and I certainly don't have a problem. I rely on your ratings, like a lot of people do. But do we know that when are we going to know when those ratings are going to change, if at all?
Well, you're absolutely right. They're not fixed. And at the same time, we would need to see races move wholesale in Democrats' direction to say that the House is in play. What we're seeing is that races are moving piecemeal. This is not a wave election in the sense that we're constantly seeing new data across a variety of districts that tells us, oh, wow, this race that looks like it was so solid for Republicans now looks extremely shaky. Or, wow, this is a seat that wasn't even on our radar, but we should be paying attention to it. In the case of New Jersey's 5th District, you have a very unique set of circumstances, and we did get new data there in the last 2 weeks that suggests that the Republican is in deep trouble, but it's more trouble of his own making. Scott Garrett has been the chair of a key financial services subcommittee, and that has generated lots of Wall Street contributions to his campaign over the past 14 years he's been in Congress. He also represents a very upscale district in Bergen County, New Jersey. It extends west to his base of Warren and Sussex counties, where he was a state legislator and a very conservative Republican in the legislature. And he has always been someone who's more socially conservative than any other member from New Jersey. And last year, he, in a behind closed doors session with other Republicans in the House, said that he would refuse to support gay Republican candidates financially. And that made it out into the press. It dried up his Wall Street contribution. And the Democrat in the race actually has heavy backing from the financial services sector. His name is Josh Gottheimer. He's a former Clinton speechwriter and Microsoft executive. And Garrett has actually, for the first time in his career, been at a financial disadvantage in a very expensive district to advertise in. There's also the fact that it's a well-educated district where voters don't react well to the type of social conservatism that you'd typically associate with a member from Alabama, and Democrats are pounding that in their ads. So it is a close race, and he's in more trouble than at any other time in his career.
Could I ask, I'm going to step back. I'm going to ask a basic question that I think not everyone knows the answer to. But you have most House elections are pretty undramatic, meaning we have small changes in the majority, in the size of the majority. And one of the big stories in American politics since 2008 has clearly been the expansion of both the emergence of the Republican majority and its expansion to pretty historic numbers, which has caused endless problems for the Obama administration. And connected to that has been a long line of literature about why it's so difficult to really change those majorities because of gerrymandering and how that polarization,
geographic clustering.
And then you have the other story, which you've now mentioned many times, of the potential for wave elections. And so we don't have many of those, but obviously we could think of 2006 or 2010 when this changes, usually in response maybe to the president and the administration. Could you just walk people through what a wave election means and what we would need to see for that to really happen this time? What would we be looking for to understand, might this be something like 2010 or 2006?
Sure. Well, wave elections usually take place in reaction to unpopular presidents. They're typically a way for voters to send a message, and they typically involve a couple of factors. Number one, the down party being really unenthusiastic and suffering from some drop-off in turnout, as Democrats did in 2010 and 2014. And second of all, independents revolt against the party in power, or they respond to a message that there should be a check on the president. We saw this in 2006 when independent voters voted for Democratic candidates by 18 points. In 2010, they voted for Republicans in congressional candidates by 19 points. I think it was primarily a response in 2010 to the ACA, to the stimulus having failed to turn around the unemployment rate at the time, to cap and trade. In 2006, it was more Hurricane Katrina in Iraq. And so there usually has to be a very harsh set of circumstances for one party for that kind of wave to develop. And the interesting thing about 2016 is that we have the most unpopular presidential nominee in history on the Republican side, but we also have had 8 years of the Democratic administration, and the last 4 years have been marked by a lot of gridlock in Congress. And so voters may be conflicted as to what type of message to send. And I think Sam hit the point well when he talked about a variety of factors, not only gerrymandering but geographic clustering. I'd add the increase of straight ticket voting.
Well, let's see. So I want to push back a little bit on this these causes that you've assigned to these previous wave elections. So at some level, it feels to me like we're always in the business of trying to figure out what the causes are, and we then assign those causes to the events that we see. And I'm going to take just a little bit of a more agnostic view just for a moment and say that under normal circumstances, the president's performance is very much on people's minds. And people swim around in this media soup, and that's what they see. They see Katrina, they see the president, they don't like the president. Just to state the obvious, there is one thing that we're all swimming in. We're marinating in it. We're going to take a nice, long, hot shower afterwards. The thing that we're marinating in is that guy on the Republican side, right? I'm not even going to say his name because we all know who it is. And so given that, it strikes me that factors like turnout, factors like how people vote down ticket, I don't know, it feels like there's a big elephant in the room and it's orange.
Well, it could be. And we could be underestimating the impact that he has down ballot right now, but we could also be overestimating it too. And I'll give you an example from the past week of polling. what we've seen at the top of the ticket since these revelations about Trump's behavior and language towards women is it's pulled college-educated Republicans back further from the nominee. There was evidence that when he was closing the gap, he was doing so because his candidacy was becoming a bit more normalized for these college-educated Republicans, and he was closing Hillary Clinton's lead among college-educated voters overall, and now that lead seems to have gone back up. Well, those college-educated voters are also the likeliest ones to be splitting their tickets at the congressional level because they typically consume the most information about who's running in their individual districts. We know that from tracking these congressional races over the past cycle. So right now, one of the reasons why this fallout is not necessarily reverberating as much in House races is that it's those same voters who are switching, rather than there being a lot of evidence that suddenly we have a lot of Democrats turning out, or suddenly we have a lot of Republicans staying home.
The other part of this isn't who has control, but it's the size of the Freedom Caucus, which I think has also been really relevant within the GOP, obviously, not just between the parties. Where will the Freedom Caucus, from what you can see, be after this election is over? Will it be about the same size? Will it grow in numbers? Are any members of the Freedom Caucus that you know of at risk in this election?
I'm glad you asked. I think it'll be about the same size or perhaps grow by a few members, and that's really bad news for Paul Ryan because we know that Republicans are likely to enter 2017 with a reduced majority, so the Freedom Caucus is likely to make up a greater share of the Republican conference than it does today. We've seen the Freedom Caucus take a hit or two. We have, for example, the primary loss of one of its leaders, Tim Huelskamp, to a more moderate candidate back in August. It's possible that Scott Garrett from New Jersey, as we alluded to earlier, could lose his race. But it's also possible that you'll see some more of the leadership allies on the Republican side who are retiring be replaced by more conservative members. An example is in Ohio's 8th District, where John Boehner resigned his seat and was replaced by Warren Davidson, who's a more conservative Club for Growth endorsed candidate, and he's a lock to hold that seat as long as he wants. So
wait, I just have to pause for a moment. So when you say more conservative, do you mean conservative in the way that you just said with Club for Growth, or do you mean? But we were talking about Freedom Caucus, which is sort of in some ways Trumpist, wanting to shut things down, which doesn't seem all that conservative. So which of those is what you mean by conservative?
Well, look, all three of those things mean different things to Republicans.
Right.
Very conservative, Club for Growth, Freedom Caucus, and Trumpist. I'd argue there are some big-time Trump supporters in the House who don't like a lot of the things that the Freedom Caucus represents. But I will say that Paul Ryan has a big math problem entering 2017. Number one, he's likely to lose around half of his majority. If Democrats gain between 10 and 20 seats, then that cuts the Republican majority about in half. And those losses are mostly going to come from the ranks of moderate Republicans, ironically the ones who are least likely to get behind Trump's candidacy. And that deprives Republican leadership of votes, valuable votes, on matters as simple as keeping the government open. So Paul Ryan has much less of a margin for error, but then there's also the fact that you could have an additional few Freedom Caucus members who owe very little allegiance to Paul Ryan. And if Clinton wins, and particularly if Democrats regain the Senate, and Chuck Schumer's the majority leader in the Senate, I think Paul Ryan will face a very, very difficult question entering the next Congress, and that, do I really want to serve as Speaker under a Democratic administration when it's clear that over the next few years, the radical element of the Republican Party is going to only metastasize under a Clinton presidency. We're going to be constantly facing calls for impeachment, special investigations into emails and basically every move she makes, that I'm going to have to violate the Hastert rule over and over again in order to avoid a debt default or keep the government open. And I could, if I simply run for Speaker in January of 2017, it's possible that the Freedom Caucus could derail my candidacy because now it requires fewer defections to do so for the smaller majority, and I could be blamed for a Clinton victory because I didn't lift a finger for Trump in the final month. This is a very, very intense drama that's brewing within House Republicans.
Is Trump, just so I understand though, is in these Freedom Caucus districts, I think you were going to get into Boehner's former district, is Trump popular? Are these areas where Trump is polling well and Ryan will face potential backlash for making some statements against him?
Well, keep in mind that Paul Ryan feels pretty good about his own political standing after winning his own primary in Wisconsin with over 80% of the vote. But that was at a time when he and Trump were as united as they'll ever be. I think if you held that primary over again after some of the things that Ryan has said, maybe he'd be down in the 70s. I'm not sure. And so this is a delicate balancing act. I think there are a lot of there are certainly a lot of districts where Trump is uniquely unpopular, but pretty universally he's got a majority of Republican support. And so I saw someone say this on Twitter the other day, and I thought it was very appropriate. The Republican Party is on the torture rack at the moment. They're almost literally being wrenched apart by their base and by the general electorate. And this is an enormous long-term problem for the party in the sense that the Ryan and Trump wings are really irreconcilable.
Well, this is the big story of this year that I think sometimes gets buried a little bit, which is that there's this sense, maybe it's under the surface, that in some sense the National Republican Party is divided and broken, in ways. I mean, look, local Republicans seem to be doing okay, but at the national level, there's something busted about them that's not going to get unbusted because the divisions in the House Republican Caucus are reflective of the divisions that we saw during the primaries. You said that Paul Ryan faces all these problems. I'm just going to be like a real governing geek for a second, which I know you have lots to say on that front. But doesn't that translate to, I'm just going to be naive, more legislative productivity?
Well, not necessarily. Not if we have divided government.
Well, so this is going to sound okay. Now I'm going to get really naive for a second here, which is I thought this was going to happen back in 2012, and I was totally wrong about this, or I can't remember what year it was. But that if the Democrats and Republicans are more closely divided and votes can be peeled off, and the Democratic caucus is united, logically, wouldn't it be possible to get to 218 votes on legislation by picking off people who shared priorities, I don't know, say on children's issues? We had Rebecca Traister on, and she was talking about children's issues. Wouldn't there be a possibility of getting some actual work done on areas where votes could be peeled off? Or am I just being too egg-headed here?
Well, you would need push for a discharge petition to even bring something to the floor. If it's a priority of a President Hillary Clinton's, then Republicans are not going to vote for it because they will be attacked mercilessly in their primaries in 2018 over anything that resembles support for a pet priority of Hillary Clinton. So if Democrats are united, they would need to essentially get 15 or 20, who knows how many Republicans to spend all of their political capital on one item. That's proven extremely difficult to do. I think the only circumstance recently that we've seen Republicans kind of get with Democrats on a priority that was supported more by Democrats was on the Export-Import Bank. And that was under immense lobbying pressure from basically the entire Washington lobbying community. So I don't think that Hillary Clinton is capable of governing any better than Barack Obama has been in the last 4 years. And I think she may be overestimating her own ability to work with both chambers and underestimating how much Congress has changed since her husband was president, because we simply won't have as many Republicans who fear retribution from a general electorate as we had 20 years ago. And I think the media environment is much, much more severely caustic and bifurcated.
This gets back to some things you wrote in your 538 piece about how the primaries are really the place where districts get decided, and that a lot of polarization, a lot of poisonous feeling in politics comes from that polarization within districts and within primaries.
Well, the other example is obviously Reagan in 1981. The Senate changes to the GOP for the first time since 1954. The House stays in Democratic hands, and Reagan is able to achieve, he gets his tax cut through. And until the 1982 midterm elections, where the Democratic majority expands in the House and becomes more liberal, he has a little wiggle room. But that's different, I think, for the reasons you outlined, than what Hillary Clinton would face. With what you're saying is she might get a Democratic Senate, but she's going to have probably still a Republican House and a more conservative Republican House majority, because this Freedom Caucus will grow. And they will be governing in a media environment and a political environment where there are not many incentives for anyone to peel away from the leadership. So and she's not Reagan, at least not now. She doesn't have that same command. This will not be an election that's a mandate for anything other than not liking Donald Trump. So it'd be a different set of circumstances. Interesting to wonder if she could somehow think of some legislative item, the equivalent of that famous tax cut in 1981, that would get some Republicans to come her way.
The problem is anything can be twisted into some evil, monstrous piece of legislation sponsored by, an evil president, even if it's
minimum wage increase?
Well, sure. Look, I think that will instantly become in Republican media Hillary Clinton's massive wealth redistribution plan.
Right.
I don't think you're going to have Republicans go for it. And keep in mind, the odds are pretty good that neither candidate is going to win with 50% of the vote. Now, obviously Hillary Clinton has a chance to get there today, but you're still talking about a president entering office with less political capital, certainly than Obama did in 2008 by far. And I think it's a very dangerous predicament for a legislative system to have a president entering office with essentially, an anti-mandate. The only reason the next president will have won because the other candidate was so unpopular. And I see that worsening gridlock in 2017, not easing it.
And these House Republicans will be like the Senate Republicans in 2009 and 10, not very eager to give her any legislative victories at this point.
Now, I have to just say that my favorite grand theory of politics right now is that everything stems from polarization, that campaigns have become less variable over time, that negative ratings for both major candidates have gone down, not just Donald Trump, who's like really in the sub-basement, but Hillary Clinton and also previous candidates, Romney, McCain, Obama. There's a general downward trend in how presidents and candidates are viewed. So I think that these things that you're describing are single data points in this broad trend in which there's just an inherent recipe for gridlock because everybody's less popular and one party just finds the other party anathema. So there's ways in which what we're seeing this year is, despite the weirdness of this year, is actually not special. It's a big global thing that we're all swimming around in.
Right. And where's the accountability? And what happens if a member of Congress just simply refuses to to work with the opposite party. Well, they're not going to face blowback in a general election, most likely. It's not going to be covered as much in the press because we don't have much local press compared to what we might have had 10 or 20 years ago. And so it really boils down to who votes in your primary. And in 2014, only 14.6% of eligible voters participated in congressional primaries. So essentially, we have a system in which 8% of people on the very far right end of the political spectrum and 7% of people on the far left of the political spectrum are electing upwards of 80 or 90% of members of Congress. I don't think most Americans realize that, and just what a crisis that is for governance. And it is frankly only continuing to get worse and would take some serious structural reforms to address.
Maybe we're almost out of time, but can you tell us if so now we're a few weeks really away from the election, and we want to know or have a sense of where this is going, both with the Senate and the House. In each case, maybe a few places we should keep our eyes on to see how this is unfolding right through Election Day.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you asked because there are a few House races that I consider bellwethers on election night to kind of help tell us what's going on early on in the evening. One is Virginia's 10th district. This is Barbara Comstock, a Republican who represents a district right outside of D.C. in the northern Virginia suburbs. And, she has a great campaign organization, but Donald Trump is massively unpopular in the wealthy D.C. suburbs. And her opponent, Lou Ann Bennett, has run a credible campaign. So I'm watching to see what happens there. I think Comstock's probably the slight favorite, but if Bennett is ahead, then maybe Democrats are on track to have a better night than we thought. Then there's also Florida's 7th congressional district. This is Orlando, Florida. It's a suburban seat. It's actually the youngest district in the state of Florida, and it's the site of the Trayvon Martin shooting. It was across the street from the Pulse nightclub shooting. You have a long-term Republican incumbent there named John Micah, who was chair of the House Transportation Committee, but has run a very lethargic campaign. He has an opponent who's half his age, who comes straight out of central casting for Democrats. A suburban mom with a business background and a national security profile. Stephanie Murphy is an immigrant as well, and is running a campaign that's been backed by a lot of money from D.C. Democrats. So that's one race to watch as well. And I'm also watching Maine's 2nd congressional district. This is northern Maine. It's a district where Donald Trump has targeted voters to pick up Maine's lone electoral vote from that district. And it's a very close House race as well between Republican incumbent Bruce Poliquin and Democrat Emily Kane. So those are three I'd watch.
Okay, well, we're unfortunately out of time, but we really want to thank you, David, for joining us today. Again, this was David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report, who just has amazing knowledge of what's going on in the House and Senate races. And just thank you for being with us and walking us through all of that.
Hey, thanks, guys. I'm a fan.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up our episode. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Bye, everybody.
You've been listening to Politics and Polls, a podcast series about the 2016 presidential election produced by WooCast. The content discussed in this podcast is intended to be informational only. It does not represent nor reflect the views of Princeton University or the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.